Hello there everyone, welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time viewers and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you about the style of warfare we're experiencing in our studies on the French War this half term, which is cavalry. If you haven't already, do check out the previous video where I went over how warfare was conducted with the infantry in this era, because in this video we're going to talk about cavalry, particularly what exactly cavalry is, the formations that cavalry could break down into, the types of cavalry that of course are included in the war, and of course the methods of combat and how typically cavalry fought in the Napoleonic and French Wars era. With all that being said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So as I said, we learned about what infantry was in our previous lesson, but now let's learn about what cavalry was. What exactly was their function in the 1890s into the early 1800s? So when we say cavalry, what we're talking about is essentially where a soldier is mounting a horse rather than walking or running around on the ground in combat. However, cavalry is much more complicated than that because they have a precise role in combat that they are meant to follow. The cavalry, because they're on a horse, are much faster than infantry, and so their roles are very different to what the infantry conducted in their combat. So, of course, cavalry numbered around 1,000 in a single regiment on the battlefield, and they were split into between 4 and 6 different squadrons, and even a total of 60 to 200 horses and cavalrymen. And this is about the amount the army's travelling cavalry would contain. The size of a squadron, though, made it suitable to move easily when switching positions on very long marches, but also still big enough that it could prove an effective fighting force when used in combat. Every cavalryman had to have a sabre that was either short and curved or long and straight, and they had a carbine rifle or short belt musket as a secondary weapon. However, given the difficulty of having to reload such weapons in combat, especially on a horse, the sabre and the sword were the cavalryman's primary weapon when in combat. Now, there are 3 types of cavalry we're going to explore in this video: light, medium, and heavy cavalry units. So first off, we'll start with our light cavalry. Now, as in the name, the light cavalry were indeed the lightest section of the cavalry units. They had the smallest and lightest horses, and typically the lightest men who would ride them. They also made up the majority of our cavalry squadrons. So typically around half or 3 of the 6 squadrons would be light cavalry. There were variations of this. For instance, in Europe, they tended to call them hussars, and in Russia, they called them Cossacks. And they were primarily used for scouting enemy positions, traversing land terrain, and conducting general skirmishing of the land. For an idea of what skirmishing is, I do strongly recommend you check out my infantry video to learn a bit more detail about how that was conducted. For instance, it was very common throughout things like the Peninsular War that we're going to study that we would see British horses scouting the land miles and miles ahead of the infantry. Of course, by scouting, they could learn the enemy positions, they could learn how many men they had, what their formations were, any leaders, anything valuable, any sort of supply lines, and they could bring that information back to the main land army, who could then conduct their operation and be more prepared, have more knowledge for what they were facing. This is the same for the terrain. Are they going to be encountering any hill terrain? Is there a sort of bottleneck position they should try and avoid? Are there any bridges that they could try and cross to cross a river and get over to the enemy side of the land? Now, as said, they weren't necessarily always scouting, always on reconnaissance. Use in battle was much more limited than, say, the medium and heavy cavalry units, who were much more focused for in these pitched battles. Still, though, the light cavalry could function as an effective guard on an army's flanks, and they could also guard the rear, especially if an enemy should try and rout the army or do a deep rising flank from behind. Again, cavalry are really quick, and so they spot the flank attack coming and move faster than the infantry can to try and counter it and prevent it attacking them. While rear, they would also charge the enemy lines as well, and even actually pursue any routed infantry to ensure they did not escape. Regardless, their primary use was indeed, in combat at least, to expose the weak points in the enemy's position so the heavier cavalry could then break the enemy's lines and push for victory. We also have the medium, or sometimes called the line cavalry. They were the next heaviest horses, but also the least common. For instance, they were more common in the British Army, where they were called dragoons or lancers, and they functioned as a very flexible unit that could charge the enemy in combat, try and break their line formations, but also guard the flanks, and even, on some rare occasions, conduct scouting operations as well. Their aim was to conduct something called shock action. They would disturb the enemy position to weaken it, to assist in the combat operations rather than to lead these attacks outright. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, he would split his line cavalry into light and heavy subgroups to further specialize their roles. Many armies, in contrast, actually did not bother to have any line or medium cavalry and did not even bother with the training for them, instead opting to simply not have them at all and therefore to focus on their heavy cavalry as well. As we go into our video series, when we explore Arthur Wellesley in greater detail, particularly in the Peninsular War, there's some key battles we're going to look at, and particularly how, with Wellesley's temperament, he valued discipline and rigorous training and made sure his British dragoons were the best cavalry in the world, and therefore were really effective in the combat he wanted them to take. Again, really exploiting the fact that medium cavalry could be this brilliant hybrid of scouting, charging, and flanking. And the final cavalry type we need to be aware of are the heavy cavalry. It's in the name, they're the heaviest cavalry and the strongest cavalrymen that are in any army. In contrast to Wellesley, who really valued the medium cavalry in his combat, Napoleon Bonaparte on the French really revered the heavy cavalry above all, famously remarking that without heavy cavalry, battles are without results. And indeed, he used cavalry to great effect during his Italian campaigns, especially during one of his greatest victories through the Alps. Their primary aim was to physically charge the enemy's line and to break it down, to literally smash through the areas the infantry were struggling to break through. Contrary to popular belief, despite being heavy cavalry, it wasn't common for them all to have metal or armoured breastplates and backplates. Most tended to actually cloth or cloths to protect them against musket fire, and even, on rare occasions, an enemy cavalry's own sabres. However, it was much more common for them to actually wear helmets to protect them in combat, especially if they were to fall off a horse. And so that's not talked about enough. Again, the skill to ride any of these horses is so valuable. And again, in a lot of ways, it wasn't necessarily being struck by the enemy or shot that would lead them to lose their lives. It would be losing, it would be falling from the horse and leaving them trampled on in combat or suffering severe head injuries. They did have some clear weaknesses, though. Because they were always charging into infantry enemy positions, enemy could incorporate certain formations to counter them. They were very vulnerable to the square formation because of the instinct of the horse. The enemy could rise up, they could form a square, tightly pat themselves together, and therefore the enemy would struggle to break through. Horses would stop or they'd gallop round. And if they did try and break through, they'd be met by a flurry of musket fire and be shot down straight away. So again, there were weaknesses to this type of cavalry. And again, it's what we have to remember here. Whatever type of cavalry that is used in combat, the tactics, the how they are used, is more often than not what determines their success. And the situation they're faced with is really what the commanders have to adapt and recognize when in combat. So there are three types of cavalry: light cavalry, medium cavalry, and heavy cavalry. But how exactly were they used? What formations did they deploy? So there are several types of formations, and one of them that we have experienced before is the line formation. Much like with the infantry, it was very common for cavalry to form this tactic as well. As in the name, all of the squadrons would literally line up against each other, with men knee to knee in distance from one another apart. This would create a massive line that would function as a moving wall, and the soldiers could charge into the enemy's position, sabres drawn, ready to slice, and smash through the enemy lines. While this was indeed the best for ensuring most swords could be used at one time, it was really tough to maintain the unity of this wall, as horses, quite naturally, would pick up different speeds when charging at the enemy, so discipline was so important to make sure they would stay online with each other. Again, they wanted to breach and overwhelm the enemy lines, and so if you were to hit them at different times, it'd be really difficult for it to really achieve this. Again, this is in a time when you lack things like smokescreen, when terrain and speed and precision is so important to overwhelm an enemy line. So they have to make sure they nail this. And so it's really why this formation, as common as it was not always the one that was necessarily used by the squadrons. They would tend to have other ones as well. It was actually more important for this line formation to be used as a kind of guarantee to victory after they'd already achieved some breaches and weakened the enemy lines with their infantry or other types of attacks first. The second type of formation is the echelon formation. And now to bring back in Napoleon, Napoleon disagreed with Wellesley and he believed that this type of formation was the best one to use. And it's because we can see with the diagram, rather than smashing the line on line into the enemy infantry position and risking being overwhelmed by the density of how many lines the enemy had, this one instead decided to use a diagonal attack, which allowed the squadrons to remain flexible enough to adapt to the scenarios that played out before them, while still having the sufficient force necessary to damage the line. When charging, the first formation would strike the line, and then following soon after, so would the second squadron, in a double shock attack. The remaining four squadrons then had a decision to make. They could charge in as well with the first and second squadrons and really smash the centre down and really break the line. Or they could realise the line was holding strong, the echelon formation wasn't necessarily working, and therefore allow them to then retreat instead. Regardless, though, it was very difficult to do. It had all this flexibility. Again, it gave soldiers, it gave cavalrymen this freedom to decide how to attack. Can we do we commit straight away? Do we test the line and then strike the centre? Do we then actually know, wait, we've done our impact, we've put a bit of shock action, we've scared them, now let's retreat? Really depending on what the situation required. And so again, it just really relied on a lot of sufficient drilling. You had to master this formation. You had to drill it, you had to practice it, and really rely on your soldiers' skill and fortitude to pull this off when on the battlefield. And the third type of formation is our closed column formation. Now, what exactly is this doing? Well, the six squadrons, they're lining up in a row, but this time it's rather than side by side, it's front to back. And so this was done to ensure the row neither had to be too bunched together or too overstretched on land. Again, remember the land they're walking on really depends how tightly compact and straight they can keep a formation. Now, this formation had one key aim, which was deception. It was a deceptive setup to confuse the enemy. So they would see the enemy and they would struggle to judge how big the cavalry actually was. Because again, if you think about yourself in a wide distance, imagine yourself on a field and you're looking far over the valley of it, and you're trying to see about a mile or more into the distance, and you see this line moving in the distance. You can recognize its horses, you know it's cavalry, but because they're in a line, you don't necessarily know how many cavalrymen there actually is. Again, when it's in the line formation, all spread out across the land, you can tell, oh, it's covering a lot of open space. There must be a big squadron here, hundreds of horses. But when it's in this closed column formation, that is much more difficult to see. And so the other strength of this was because you were unsure how big they were, once the horses were closer, they were within striking distance, they could very quickly transition into a line formation and rapidly attack before the enemy could realize and set up the appropriate defense or move in the right way. It also meant that it proved an effective breakout tactic, the horses able to easily funnel in and flee through a single gap that they could break through in the enemy's own formation should they have encircled the squadrons. Therein lies this formation's key weakness, though. Its vast length made it very vulnerable to flank attacks, especially if they were caught off guard. Quite simply, it's really difficult to turn fast. And you imagine you're on a horse and you've got your sword out. You need to turn the entire horse before you can move and strike an infantryman's position. And therefore, it was really difficult to defend yourself if these incoming attacks could indeed come towards you from a flank, because quite simply, you did not have enough sabres out in the open to do so. This formation, much like the column formation with the infantry, was really vulnerable to artillery fire. If we imagine an artillery cannon or an artillery battery was right in front of this formation, aim it in the distance, and fire their grape shot, they could theoretically shred through some members throughout all the squadrons and really cause a lot of damage and a lot of death in their attack. Therefore, it really was a poor choice to use if they were in range of enemy cannons and howitzers. Again, we'll talk about more of that when we go over how artillery was used as well. Now that's our formation. We've got our types of cavalry, we've got our formations, but how exactly did cavalry fight? So let's discuss then how exactly cavalry was used in combat. The first and primary way cavalry was used was for charging. This was their primary method of attack and have been this way since the 12th and 13th centuries. Heavy and line cavalry were typically the ones who would do this, and they performed this action. Again, think of our line formation. They would form this line and then they would charge me. They would be slow at first to maintain their unity, then trotting and then galloping to hit the enemy's lines with maximum force from the speed of their movement. Since keeping the line straight to maintain the impact of the war was so important, they had to make sure the line started slow, make sure the straightness was maintained for as long as possible. It was also quite common for this to be paired with an artillery barrage as well. Napoleon was very much a pioneer in this department. He would use artillery in conjunction with the charge to maximize the charge's impact, knowing that a weakened position from the artillery would be unable to be tightly packed together and therefore vulnerable to the swift form of a charge. It was also quite common for cavalrymen to have their swords drawn before charging. However, veterans from the campaigns in Italy under Napoleon and the Peninsular War under Wellesley knew better. They learned actually it was better to delay drawing the swords until really close to the enemy because they did not want to make it so obvious to them that they were going to be charging. They wanted to really hide that, maintain some sort of deception. Again, much like column formation was deceiving their numbers, and they would be unsure exactly what their aim was to do. Quite simply, it robbed the enemy of time to prepare the defences necessary to meet the incoming charge. It was also quite rare, we have to say this, for cavalry to charge into other cavalry lines, since the horses would instinctively stop and leave the men, kind of, to be honest, awkwardly staring at each other. Again, you couldn't really swing and strike with your sword if your horses were stopped and not close that distance. There actually is a case of one charge in the Peninsular War at Torres Vedras that saw the French and the English literally just kind of waving their sabres at each other before one realised this was not going to work, it was not worth the effort, and they all retreated back to their lines. As such, charging was really basically exclusively used against infantry, especially ones that were tired from fighting another infantry charge shortly before. The second type of combat for cavalry was skirmishing. Now, this was performed by light cavalry, and this focused on harassing the enemy. Like our infantry skirmishers, the light cavalry wandered from the main army and struck at positions more individually, very much detached, doing their own thing. They, of course, had lower firepower given the lack of loadability of their muskets, and their aim wasn't to overpower the enemy. It was to weaken them as best they could. By weakening, distracting, confusing, when the line and heavy cavalry came in later, they would have a much easier time thanks to the efforts of our light cavalry. Even then, though, we have to be honest, this was quite rare to do. It was only really allowed when they were within 100 meters, roughly thereabout, of the enemy's position. And only, therefore, if they could do it by surprise as well. If they were spotted, if the enemy knew they were there, it wasn't really worth doing, again, because they lacked the firepower and intensity necessary to really succeed with it. They instead would pair better with infantry. They would be, of course, do some reconnaissance together, typically with the fellow skirmishers, and of course, the infantry would be able to help out if they're in hazardous terrain that was very difficult to maneuver. If it had been raining a lot, or they were in a very muddy field, going over lots of hills. The horses would struggle to cope with that, and so they could help to get them back onto a flat surface. Or even better, the cavalry could protect and guard the infantry's flanks from a wide distance. Again, knowing if the infantry were engaged and needed some support, the light cavalry were the quickest and most reliable to reach them in that short span of time. And our third method of attack is swarming or foraging. Now, this was performed by our light infantry, and it relied on a very loose formation that enabled the soldiers to target a single enemy soldier they were intending to execute. The formation was quite loose, but it still depended on the cavalry remaining close enough together to rally to form their own lines and charge, or even better, really, was on the counter-attack. They would counter-attack into enemy cavalry or skirmishers by quite literally swarming their position with quick speed and a lot of intensity. In practice, foraging was used most often to chase down enemy infantry that were routed or were even isolated out in the open during any cavalry skirmish or scouting operations. Again, though, no matter the method chosen, the correct choice always depended on the circumstances the cavalry were used in, and again, how their commanding officers made sure that they were used. Again, the most common way they were used was to break infantry lines. They would discover the enemy infantry and then charge in with a line attack, typically early or towards the end of a battle. It also was quite common for cavalry to overthrow infantry during the peak of a battle. Now, what this means is they struck the enemy infantry when they were already exhausted, facing a charge from the infantry's own fusiliers. Already, since charging first would risk the opponent's grenadiers, again remember those taller, stronger infantrymen guarding the flanks, from having the strength to fight them off. It also was quite a wise idea to allow the enemy's line infantry to fire their muskets, waste their volley fire, and cavalry could charge in quickly. Again, the idea was speed, intensity, to catch the opponent off guard. You imagine a line of infantry who've just shot all their volley fire off, and are still rummaging, trying to reload their muskets, their brown vest muskets. And now suddenly, this big line wave of just fast moving heavy cavalry is about to strike their position and rip them apart. And that's the reality of it. Again, we're going to see this in a lot of campaigns going forward. We're going to see especially how Wellesley used this at Vittoria for some brilliant success. We're going to see how the French could use it too at Quatre Bras to wipe out the 69th Infantry, the British, at Waterloo. And we'll even see how their use against artillery is going to change throughout the war. Again, when you're firing an artillery battery, they're really vulnerable to that, and it's going to be crucial for avoiding the artillery's cannons that were firing in their position, and again moving so quickly that they can make sure they were out of sight or even out of distance before the artillery team could move their cannons to resight them, which would buy valuable time for the cavalry to move and attack with their squadrons with great success. And so there we have it. That's our lesson there on our cavalry unit. Again, some of you may have, if you've already checked out my World War One videos, will have been able to make this perceptive look here. Cavalry were the precursor to the tank. Before the tanks, cavalry were the ones who provided that lightning fast speed to generate some key success and shock action in combat. Much as we're going to see how they're best used in combination with artillery. This horse artillery is in a lot of ways the precursor to how the tank was used in the First World War, again, with the combination of combined arms. So I think it's quite interesting to really note that here. We're kind of seeing this evolution of combat that happens over time. Again, we see how the cavalry are used here in combination with artillery for great success, in much the same way that tanks were used with artillery in combination during the First World War. Again, it's just a fascinating thing to think about as we go forward in our series, how history connects and how methods and combat of war change over time. All in all, I hope you found this video quite insightful, quite useful as always. Do remember to subscribe, like, and comment. Again, your engagement is always appreciated. In our next video, we're going to explore how artillery is used, particularly by Napoleon Bonaparte, and how he and the French used it to great success. And then we'll get into our key narratives of the battle, we'll get into the context of this era as well, and what the war on land is actually like. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.